Okay, so it's noon, so we can get started. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today, and welcome to the Coalition of Global Health Research's webinar series on climate change. So my name is Pratima Baral. I'm a research fellow for a bi-campus global health research program called the Global Strategy Lab here in Toronto. And essentially, we try to tackle some of the transnational issues that our world faces today. And those include antimicrobial resistance and climate change, of course. And we look at this with a global health governance lens. So for today's webinar, our focus will be on the intersection of climate change and migration. We know that climate change is increasingly influencing human mobility and that the health of migrating populations is affected at the origin, en route, and of course at their destination. And there's a higher risk of adverse health outcomes associated with climate-related forced displacement. And this is especially true among among women, children, the elderly, and those with pre-existing health conditions. So in light of all of this, I'm very excited to be able to introduce you today to an expert in the nexus of migration and climate change, Lynn Borklund-Béliveau. She is a researcher and advisor at Médecins Sans Frontières and an affiliate at the Center for Refugee Studies at York University. And in addition, she's also started collaborating with the Datteley Institute for Global Health Research, also based at York University, and led by Dr. James Wierbicki. So Lynn's expertise lies in forced migration, transnational networks, and climate politics. She has extensive experience with non-governmental organizations and the United Nations in the fields of humanitarianism and human rights. And she has worked in a wide range of countries in East Africa, Middle East, and Latin America. Currently, she is leading efforts aimed at feeding strategic decision-making for field operations in climate hotspots, exposing inadequacies of the global migration system, and towards improving protection and assistance mechanisms for displaced populations. Her presentation today is accordingly on the nexus of climate change, migration, and humanitarian needs, and we're thrilled to have this opportunity to learn from her today. So before I pass the floor over to Lynn, I have a few housekeeping items. First, we are recording this webinar so that people can watch it at a later date if they'd like, and it will also be posted on the CCGHR's website. In terms of structure, Lynn will be speaking for about 20 minutes. I will then open the floor for questions. You can post your question in the chat box on the side, and I'll be happy to read them out so that Lynn has a chance to respond. Given that we are quite a few people today, I think that will be the best way moving forward. If there is a lull and you absolutely want to speak your question out loud, you can also unmute yourself and do so. So for now, given the number of people here today, though, I will ask everybody to introduce themselves, and we hear some background. Let me just hit that person. Thank you. So for now, given the still a little bit of a background noise. Hang on, let me just person, and then we can get started. Okay, so for everybody, the mute button is at the bottom left of your Zoom screen. So please keep that on until we reach Q&A. So with that said, Lynn, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Prativa, for the introduction and for organizing this session. I'm pleased to share some of my and Médecins Sans Frontières experiences and reflection on this important topic. And I will try to share my presentation. Let's see. There. Can you see it?
Yeah. Yes, we can see it.
Okay. So maybe in addition to, and before I get started to what you were saying, over the last 6 months, I have been carrying out the study and the review for Médecins Sans Frontières and for one of the sections of Médecins Sans Frontières, so the MSF Greece, looking at the nexus of climate change, migration and health, and with the aim of improving our operations in climate hotspots, and also to see how we can more strategically respond to climate-related migration. For those of you who may not know, Médecins Sans Frontières, or MSF, is a medical humanitarian organization that is working in over 70 countries, providing medical and humanitarian assistance to people in need. And the outline of my presentation today will be as such. I will start off by talking a bit about patterns and predictions of climate-related migration linked to climate hotspots. And then I will discuss the health impacts and humanitarian impacts of linked to climate-related migration. I will share some of my perspectives on the policy environment and legal categories, and end off by talking about MSF programs in climate hotspots and around climate hotspots with displaced populations. So on this picture, you see a Rohingya family fleeing Myanmar in 2017, crossing into Bangladesh. They flee because of violence, but they're faced with climatic hazards during their flight, only to arrive in Bangladesh, where they most likely will be faced with continued environmental risks. Millions of people are forced to leave their homes today from places like Myanmar, Central African Republic, the Democratic Republic of Congo, South Sudan, Philippines, Yemen. And the reasons that people flee are multiple and very complex. However, many share a common set of experiences while in flight, either within their own countries or across international borders. And in countries of transit and reception, we're often not looking at a refugee crisis per se or a humanitarian crisis, but rather a crisis that is caused by increasingly restrictive migration policies and practices that are actually targeting refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants. Now, climate change is increasingly influencing human mobility. A large portion of people that are on the move today are so because of extreme weather events and environmental degradation that is exacerbated by anthropogenic climate change. And it's important to point out, and as you can see on this slide, that climate change adds to the already complex interplay between factors that determine individuals, families, and even whole communities' decision and capacity to flee, to move, or to stay. So climate change as a driver shouldn't be looked at as a unique driver, but rather it should be looked at how it plays a role in the way that people are moving. It should also be said that climate-related migration is a bit different from other types of migration in the sense that it often becomes permanent, because what we're increasingly seeing is that people that leave because of climate change or because of climate-related reasons may not be able to go back for the reason that their places of origin may no longer exist. For instance, the Pacific or sinking islands in the Pacifics, or desertification in West Africa. And in terms of forecasts, in terms of numbers of people moving, they vary a lot. So the IPCC recently said that they believe that some 150 million people will be displaced by 2050 because of climate change. Other sources are talking about 1 billion people being displaced. And for this reason, for the reason that the numbers vary so much, I actually tend to not use statistics because it rather confuses than clarifies. However, that said, the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center now estimates that some 22.5 million people are annually displaced by sudden onset climate impacts such as storms and floods. And these events arguably displace over three times as many persons as conflict every year. On top of that, other tens of millions of people are displaced because of slow burning environmental crises such as sea level rise, droughts, and natural resource contamination. And it's the poorest, most vulnerable exposed groups, including children, women, and those with pre-existing conditions, that are living in climate hotspots who are the ones hit the hardest. And the large majority of climate refugees or environmentally displaced or climate migrants, or what you want to call them, actually stay within their own countries and seek refuge in overpopulated urban areas and mega cities, where they often face continued environmental, physical, and psychological threats. And their distress and their needs are overshadowed by the focus on refugees and international migrants. Now, in terms of the hotspots, the regions experiencing strong climate shocks and that are also home to densely populated impoverished communities are particularly vulnerable. These are the actual hotspots. It's in that sense about a combination of exposure and vulnerability, because we know that, for instance, there's climate events and extreme weather events happening across the world. So the exposure may be happening in many different locations, but we should also look at the vulnerability, how populations are affected by these events. And some of the so-called hotspots are large river deltas in Africa and South Asia, semi-arid regions in Africa, Middle East, and South Central Asia, glaciers and river basins, especially in the Himalayas, low-lying islands that I've referred to already, and also areas that are increasingly affected by rapid onset climate impacts in Central America, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. And the different extreme weather events, whether they're sudden or slow, have an influence on how people are moving. So I should say that the sudden extreme weather events, such as storms, hurricanes, and floods, often create sudden displacement as well. So mass displacement that happens within a short period of time, and that is often temporary because people tend to return to their places of origin from this. While the slow environmental degradation crisis, for instance, drought, often cause displacement and migration over longer periods of times, sometimes mass displacement, and are often and increasingly becoming more permanent. Now, to the health impacts and humanitarian impacts of climate-related displacement, I think I want to start by saying that looking at climate change and health in general, and looking at the research that is available, and now I'm thinking of some of the forerunners in terms of research for climate change and health, being Dr. Anthony McMichael, Dr. Anthony Costello, Dr. Rainer Sauerbord. They all say that climate change and environmental degradation actually don't create new types of diseases, but that they increase the burden of some climate sensitive ones with a typical pattern of time, space, and risk groups. And I'm saying that because similar apply to climate-related migration. The health impacts of climate-related migration have, at least to my knowledge, not yet proven to be significantly different from the health impacts of other forms of migration. The health of migrating populations in general is affected at their place of origin and route and at destination by climate change itself, either directly or indirectly, and mediated through ecological and social systems. Climate-related migration is increasingly seen as an adaptive response to climate change, and this is true. However, it should be said that people tend to move to sites of climate and environmental risk. So they move maybe because of climate change, and then they move to locations that are affected by climate change and environmental risk. And this can adversely impact their health, both of the mobile populations and the host populations. And a clear example of this is urban settings and mega cities that have become so-called climate in migration hotspots, not only for climate-related migration, but more in general. And as we all know, there's an increasing trend of urbanization. And I recently heard that the number of 2.5 billion people living in urban environments by 2050, mainly in Africa and Asia. And so urban settings are also located in areas that often are prone to flooding, and in combination with rising temperatures that we're seeing, they're becoming what many are referring to as overpopulated, polluted heat islands. So to me and to MSF and many others, it's becoming increasingly clear that humanitarian actors and others need to understand much better the implication of climate change in urban settings in order to be able to address the resultant health impacts from extreme heat, pollution, water contamination, overcrowding, undernutrition, or exclusion from healthcare. Now, in the cases of climate-related forced displacement, the risk of adverse health outcomes are much higher, especially among those with existing vulnerabilities. And I want to group them together with people that are trapped, because evidence indicate that climate change also lead to people not being able to move. So people that find themselves in situations where they want to move and feel the need to move, but are not able to do so. They often have limited access to healthcare, and the health issues that are frequently seen include psychosocial ill health, exposure to environmental risks in general, and food insecurity. And one example of this is Somalia. I worked in Somalia during the drought in 2011, 2012. And what we were seeing a lot is that the droughts often led to people having less access to care, less access to food, but they wanted to stay or they were not able to move. Then when they saw themselves in very vulnerable situations, they moved to locations close by, often to urban settings. So they made their first move internally, and because of climate-related issues. And then in the urban settings, they were faced with a diverse number of risks, which ultimately led them to cross into either Ethiopia or to Kenya. So that was their last resort in order to seek assistance. That leads me in a bit to the policy environment of climate-related migration. And there are a number of principles, conventions, international agreements that seek to provide guidance on climate-related migration, including the 2018 Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration. Now, the majority of these legal frameworks, or rather guiding principles, I would say, are non-binding, so they're soft laws, and they emphasize short-term displacement. Less efforts have until date been made to minimize long-term displacement and vulnerability for internally displaced and people living in urban settings. So it has become clear that it's internally displaced people and people living in urban settings, it's often the same groups. They are the groups that repeatedly fall into gaps between existing protection and system frameworks. So while there is an agreement that people are increasingly moving because of climate change or the effects of climate change, there's currently no paradigm for the understanding of the relationship between climate change and mobility, and there's also no common vocabulary. And categories that are accorded to people who are caught up in displacement and migration are, as we know, not neutral. They're used by states, by authorities, and by others, including humanitarian organizations, to determine those who are prioritized, those who deserve, those who are welcome, and those who are not welcome. And so I'm saying this because early on in the climate change and displacement debate, scholars commonly refer to climate refugees when talking about people that had been displaced or that had to leave their homes because of degradation of the environment. Now, this narrative was and still is perceived by many to be too alarmistic, as they insist that climate refugees doesn't reflect reality, but that migration rather should be seen as a powerful adaptation strategy. Also, in the context of climate change, refugee law is only applicable in very limited instances, when disaster creates conflict, persecution, or a breakdown of public orders, and also when the persons have crossed an international border. So instead, those displaced in the context of climate change is a term that is commonly used. And while this term, those displaced in the context of climate change, does accurately not make a judgment about whether the effects of climate change were the single driver, and it supposedly de-victimize persons that have been forced to leave their homes. Now, the issue is that it also depoliticizes the whole issue, and it somehow justifies a status quo in which the persons and the states that are most affected by disasters are the ones that are supposed to be the primary responders. And so to stress the urgency in the matter and to somehow repoliticize the debate with the aim of improving humanitarian assistance, legal and political frameworks for climate-related migration, the term climate refugee is increasingly used again by some. And this takes me into MSF and the programs that we have across the world. Let me just go back to the hotspots. If you look at the hotspots, and then now you look at MSF's programs across the world. This is not the most updated map of our programs. We work, for instance, in Somalia now, but it's the most updated map I could find. And as you can see, we have a lot of programs in the climate hotspots, large-scale medical and humanitarian programs. And we work both within the hotspots and in neighboring the hotspots with people that have been displaced or that have moved. And the reason that they have moved may be intensified by storms, floods, and droughts. And as a medical humanitarian organization, we obviously pay special attention to the health and the social needs of migrants, displaced persons, host communities, and also the trapped populations that I was speaking about. And two of the questions that we're currently asking ourselves and that I've been thinking a lot about the last couple of months is, does MSF as a medical humanitarian organization need to change its strategic orientation or its machinery in order to adapt to the humanitarian needs exacerbated by climate change and environmental degradation, or are we already prepared for it? And this question comes with a sub-question where we know that the fact that extreme weather events, both sudden and slow, will continue to happen, which means that we will see an increasing number of people moving. So are we still prepared for it? And the second question is, in terms of MSF's positioning, should we stand behind environmental scientists and support their call, or should we possibly in parallel also start to speak more about and share more about information about what we're seeing in these climate hotspots and what the humanitarian consequences partly linked to climate change may be? To give you a few examples of what we see, I want to start with talking about northeastern Nigeria, where prolonged and intensified droughts over the last years, partly linked to El Niño effect, but also arguably linked to climate change, have decreased surface water levels, which has caused severe water scarcity. This and the increased use of groundwater have decreased water quality, which then has influenced food security, vector pathogens, and eventually the likelihood of people falling and or staying sick. So this forces rural populations, so farmers, herders, pastoralists that live off their land, to leave their land and move towards displacement and urban settings where water quality is and waterborne diseases and security are often major concerns. Another situation linked to climate-related migration is Central America. So El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, where the vast use of monocultures in commercial agriculture, so for sugar canes, and also the increased water scarcity, which is arguably linked to climate change. This is disputed a lot within Central America, but that this has reportedly intensified human mobility and also violence, and it may also be one of the causes to the increasing level of malnutrition that has been seen, and to some types of different chronic diseases. And some of you might have followed the discussions around the Migrant Caravans over the last week, where we see people from Central America moving through Mexico to seek asylum in the United States. And the primary reason that they are moving is pointed out to be violence, and I'm not disputing this. What we're seeing, though, is that there's an increasing number of voices that are also talking about what some of the underlying factors may be, and what role climate change may have played. And I think it's important to say that what we're seeing is that people are primarily and often first displaced and forced to leave their lands, and then they move from rural from their places of origin, often in rural areas, into urban settings, for instance Guatemala City, where they're faced with continuous and diversified risks, and where violence, and for Central America gang violence, is a large risk, obviously, and this is eventually what made them, or what forces them to later cross international borders and go to seek asylum. The last example I want to share with you is Bangladesh, and I mentioned Bangladesh a bit briefly in the beginning of my presentation. Here, millions of displaced persons and migrants live in urban settings, including in the capital Dhaka and in Cox's Bazar. So Kutupalong is one large refugee settlement in Cox's Bazar, where we now see up to 1 million Rohingya refugees living. These locations are both overcrowded settlements and areas that are disposed to flooding in the case of Cox's Bazar, but also monsoons and heat waves. And large-scale deforestation is taking place to create more space for the up to 1 million Rohingya refugees that arrived since last year. And pollution and contamination levels, including industrial in Dhaka, are critical. And sanitation and sewage systems are inadequate, and consequently these urban settings have become breeding grounds, massive breeding grounds, for cardiovascular, respiratory, vector and infectious disease. So what this means is that people who already suffer the consequences of wide-scale violence that they have faced in Myanmar, or suffer the consequences of having been forced to leave their lands within Bangladesh, and that then have faced a wide number of barriers while fleeing to the urban settings, are now faced with environmental illnesses that MSF and other actors are not necessarily experts at responding to. So to end, and before I say thank you, I want to stress 3 points that we can discuss further. The first one is that some populations will adjust to environmental conditions and benefit from the adaptation efforts and development paradigms. And that is very important and good. Now, others will not. Others will not be able to adapt to what they're faced with, and will be forced to flee their places of origin because of climate-related impacts. Hence, the importance of improved humanitarian assistance and protection mechanisms for climate vulnerable. The second point I want to stress is that the nexus between climate change, migration, and health is definitely an understudied area that requires further attention. And especially in and around climate hotspots, most of the research and case studies that we hear about are from states of the United States, so Florida, California, Alaska. We're also hearing a lot about climate-related migration in and around Europe. We hear less about localized situations in, for instance, Africa or Southeast Asia. And the third point that I want to stress is that we as health and practitioners and researchers, we need to understand much better the implications of climate change for urban migration. And we need to adapt assessment tools accordingly, and also programs in order to properly address the health impacts. So in short, we just need to get better at urban health. And like someone was saying in the conference I went to last week, we're in an era of slumification. So let's get good at responding to the needs in these slums. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lynn. So everybody, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask Lynn, please post in the group chat on your right, and I'll be sure to read them to her, so there's some sort of organization. I'm not sure if this is a question. So from Nidhi, she says post-migration health-related response mechanism is a responsibility of the host country and the states. The additional financial burden is sometimes used as a deterrent for countries to endorse and support human migration related decisions and policies at the global level. So I think that was more of a comment. And she says, thank you, Lynn. So from Afnan, regarding the needs of climate refugees being overshadowed by other refugees, i.e. those fleeing war and persecution, from an ethics perspective, how does MSF as a humanitarian organization and other international organizations deal with having a limited amount of resources and a high population in need? And the sub-question is, it seems like it comes down to needs. So how do you define needs from an MSF perspective?
So the first question in terms of how we prioritize, if we're looking at internal displacement versus international displacement, I wouldn't say it's about how we run our operations or how we respond to needs, but it's rather how the policy debates and the attention that is given to different types of migration is happening. And in that sense, I would say that MSF, together with many others, have in the last 10 years and more intensely in the last 5 years been focusing very much at international migration, at migration happening along migration routes, and looking at what are the humanitarian consequences of certain policies that are implemented and that may be preventing people from seeking asylum in different locations. So while we are present and responding to the needs inside of countries, there's less debate about what's happening to them. And it's more of a debate that is linked to development and how the people that are within their own country and have been displaced, how they can adapt to their new situations, rather than looking at what may be some of the migration responses that may be needed, and what on the one hand is the role of the host country, which may be the country of origin, but also of other countries that may become the reception countries, or if they don't, how could they support? And in terms of how we identify needs, we have widespread and extensive protocols when we go into different crises that we use to identify needs within a population, and based on that we make a decision where to intervene and where to not.
We have a follow-up question by Elizabeth. She says, to add to the question by Afnan, I will appreciate your comments on how students could also get engaged in the work by MSF in tackling this important global health challenge that seems not just a problem of the global south, but the entire world.
I think, like I was mentioning, I think that especially in terms of research and students, it's to look at what is happening in and around climate hotspots and climate-related migration that is happening in these areas. And that can be done partly by contacting organizations like MSF, or actually putting pressures on organizations like MSF to share more information about these locations. When I've been doing my research and my review, I am in contact with a lot of universities that are in the countries that are considered to be climate hotspots. So I would say as well that it would be extremely important to first of all recognize that there is research happening, although the information is often not being shared widely enough, and also to see how we, both as researchers and practitioners, could make and develop further partnerships with actors in the countries that are affected, and with both academia and more practitioners in these countries.
Mm-hmm. So the next question is, what is your opinion on understanding the underlying health problems burdened by women and children within these urban settings that are settled by climate refugees? I imagine women and girls are being neglected with a focus on their menstrual health and sexual health needs.
Yeah, that is a very good question. I think that women and children are often the ones that are affected most when there's a crisis. Both it can be related to climate change, to extreme weather events, or to conflict. And as an organization, we focus very much on mother and child health, reproductive health, and these are our main groups that we actually focus on. And I think that that is something that others obviously are doing as well, but that we always need to get better at. We just need to always remember that these are the groups that are most affected. So when we go in and respond to a humanitarian crisis, or when we're looking from a distance at the humanitarian crisis, then we should keep in mind that these are the groups that actually are in need of assistance the most, and that are often the ones falling within what I was talking about, the gaps of protection and assistance frameworks, because either they have not been able to seek the right assistance or access assistance because of different types of barriers, or they are just not aware of their rights and the legal frameworks that, or policies and conventions that may be actually applicable to their individual situation.
We have a few more questions. Although climate change and environmental problems are salient in driving the climate-induced migration, there seems to be a large political web influencing how nations and organizations are responding to these issues. There doesn't seem to be much response from the developed world or organizations to support nations and regions with hotspots. Are there any programs besides the short-term UN policies that MSF is aware of that shows a commitment to support these hotspot regions?
I think that, or I would say that there is a lot of support from the developed world or from countries, let's say from countries that are less affected by climate change. So there is support to countries that are in these climate hotspots. However, from my perspective, most of the support is channeled through development programs, and the focus is very much on adaptation, on the resilience, how people can find a way of staying either in their places of origin or staying within their own country, and adapt to their new situation. So in that sense, I would say that a focus on livelihoods and improving their situations within the country, there's quite a lot. There's less efforts that are actually looking at people that are forced to leave their places of origin because of climate or linked to climate change, and that may be crossing or going to urban settings or potentially crossing an international border. And I would say that partly because climate change and health and climate change and migration has been perceived as a developmental issue until recently, but also because there is, I would say, little political will to link this issue to the larger debate around international migration. So it's often dealt with in silos. You see that climate change and climate experts are looking at how to develop policies around climate change, and then you have development actors that are looking at how do we make people more resilient, and then you have migration policies and actors looking around that. So, and it's often dealt with in silos, and I think that there needs to be much more transversal work on that specific topic if we are to improve assistance to climate related migration.
Thank you. Another question has to do with, and that was one that I was curious about as well, was you talked a little bit during the talk about legal bindings and climate refugees. And someone, one of our attendees, was also asking you about what it constitutes a refugee. And do you think it's counterproductive to add forced displacement due to climate change to the UNHCR definition as to what defines a refugee? Assuming countries who are signatories to the convention would be liable to recognize these groups as refugees, do you think it's a necessary step in the right direction, or does it have the potential to decrease protections by widening the definition too much?
I think that the person asking the question is also responding to the question. This is a large and very politicized debate, and the question whether or not the refugee definition should be widened or broadened or deepened has been going on more or less since the Refugee Convention from 1951. Now, I would say, and this is what most people looking at it are saying. For instance, one person really doing a lot of research is Dr. Elizabeth Ferris, that I would recommend that you read a bit from. And she's saying that by opening up the discussion around the definition and by considering to include climate change, on the one hand, we're opening a can of worms because it's, why would we then only include climate related migration? There would also be other groups of people that would potentially need to be included in this definition as well. And on the other hand, the argument that is often made is that if we are to broaden the definition of what a refugee is, that may actually impact the possibilities for current people that fall within the refugee definition to obtain asylum. So it might actually become harder for people that are fleeing conflict to become refugees if we are to add another group of people and an increasing group of people that will outnumber the people that flee because of violence. So in that sense, I would say that it's important to look at what frameworks and policies are already existent within countries, because internationally there are very few binding agreements for displaced populations or migrants that have left their places of origin because of climate change. But within countries, we're seeing an increase of at least frameworks or agreements, they're calling it, and that is dealing with this and that is outlining what rights these people would have.
The next question is around mental health. Has MSF begun to look at mental health outcomes for climate refugees? And if so, what is being found?
MSF is, the approach that MSF has is that we're not specifically looking at climate refugees or climate related migration, but we're responding to people that have been forced to leave their homes because of diverse reasons. And like I was saying, we are present in climate hotspots and we're seeing people that have been displaced by climate related migration or climate because of climate change. That said, one of our main components in terms of providing assistance to displaced populations is mental health services and psychosocial care. And I would say that we don't see a difference in the mental health needs among people that have been displaced, possibly linked to climate change, versus others that have been displaced for other reasons. The only difference that we may see, and that I think will be increasingly important to keep in mind, is the fact that, like I was saying, there's an increasing number of people that leave their places of origin and that will never be able to go back. So the feeling of lost land, for instance, your island sank, your country just doesn't exist anymore, or the impact of your home country or your region just becoming uninhabitable because of desertification, is something that obviously has a large impact on mental health.
We have an additional question. Okay, what mechanisms do you have in place to transition your MSF experience to international migration policies and decisions? And would you be able to provide an example?
So the mechanisms that we have in place are multiple and very widespread. I would say that in one way they're organized, in another way they're not. We're a huge organization, and we call ourselves a movement with many different both operational sections and programs across the world, and then partner sections all over the world, with somewhat obviously we have a similar perspective, but we also act on what we're seeing in the places where we're based. That said, we do have a framework in how we look at migration and displacement today and how we respond to it. And I think that if you look at what has been happening over the last years and MSF's response to international migration and restricted migration policies in Europe, but also in Australia and in the United States, the way we work is often that we work on multiple levels. We always base our advocacy and our efforts on what we see in the field, and that's the core. It's always how many people are we treating, what do these people tell us, and we use that information when engaging with governments, with other actors, with donors, and more publicly when we're speaking as well out in media. So in that sense, we're putting pressures on many different levels and using different tools.
Great. Does anybody else have any questions? If you do, please post them in the chat below. I guess if I could take a step back and go back to what you discussed about the strategic orientations that MSF might be taking to include, to expand humanitarian responses to those affected by climate change. Do you feel that this type of direction is starting to make its way to in the agenda of other international organizations as well, or is this something that MSF is kind of, leading?
No, MSF is definitely not leading it, and I don't want to give at all the impression of that. I think that many other organizations and humanitarian entities and development organizations have for quite long been talking about the effects of climate change and been raising its concern, standing behind climate scientists, but also talking more about the links that climate change may have to violence or to migration. MSF's approach is and has for long been that we're providing assistance to people no matter what. We don't really care why they left, but it's more about the needs, and that continues to be its approach, and it will continue to be its approach. I think where we're shifting a bit, or where some of us are trying to shift it a bit, is that when we respond to needs and to people that have been affected by climate change, that we're more aware of it. And for that reason, for instance, that we start to look more at urban settings. We're present in urban settings, but I think that we can really improve the way that we're responding in urban settings. And I think we have very much been looking at international migration and the impact of international migration, if you think more from an advocacy perspective, while climate change and the impacts of climate change will most likely be one of the things that we talk more openly about in years to come. So it's a process, and I think that we're seeing what other organizations are doing, and we're working in parallel with them. And I think that we're all, as a humanitarian community, realizing that it's not only about knowing that climate change has an impact on the needs, and specifically on the needs of the already most vulnerable populations in the world, but it's also about how can we, as a humanitarian community, be more strategic in the way that we position ourselves and pressure governments to actually act upon it.
Mm-hmm. That makes a lot of sense, given some political administrations thinking that climate change may not exist. So that makes a lot of sense. The next question that we have is around the common vocabulary and how you mentioned that that's something that's missing. So how can we get there, and what are some reliable resources related to the topic of climate change and migration where we can get some knowledge?
I think, first of all, it's important to just realize that the language and the labels used when referring to people that have been displaced or migrate because of climate change comes with a set of political perspectives, and that the terminologies that we use also very much linked to policy and to responses. And there are already numerous categories that are used for people that have had to leave partly because of climate change. So I just mentioned a few, like climate-related migration, or those displaced in the context of climate change. But then you have disaster victims, climate refugees, environmental displaced persons, etc., etc. And I think that it's not really, I wouldn't say, or at least it's not the MSF's responsibility to or task to come up with the terminology and or say that this is the right terminology. I think that we might never be able to agree about the terminology, because, like I said, it comes with a set of different wills and perspectives when you use a certain terminology. I think, however, that it's important to notice that while climate refugee may not be the right terminology, because indeed the large majority of people that are displaced linked to climate change stay within their own country, it does stress the urgency in the matter, and it does actually point out that the ones that are affected by climate change and that are forced to leave their places of origin are most of the time the least responsible for climate change. So it's actually to put more pressure on the governments that are most responsible for climate change. That's what I would say.
Mm-hmm. And just a reminder to everybody that there is a list of suggested readings on our website, on the webinar's webpage, and you're welcome to browse it and read some of the recommended readings that Lynn has provided. So we've talked a lot about the need to do more and the urgency of the situation, but maybe you can talk about recent areas of progress that we've made, and you've made reference to a few today, to address all this, and what your thoughts are on what we can do on an individual level, whether it's as a researcher or as students. What can we do as well?
Yeah, it's easy to just, when you speak about humanitarian crisis, and also now when you speak about climate change, to have a very to leave a seminar or a webinar or a conference with a very dark perspective of what the future may bring. And I think the importance, and where we see some progress, is that we're starting to make the links. It starts to be talked about. Like I was saying, Central America and migration from and within Central America is increasingly being linked to climatic events. And I for a couple of weeks ago, ICRC was speaking out about the link between climate change and conflict. And I think that all these small efforts are improving and humanitarian agencies' response and reaction, and forces us to think more strategically in how we engage in the topic, and it forces us to look at, okay, so we are working with internally displaced persons, we're working in urban settings, but how can we become better at it? Because we're realizing that urban settings, while we're present, it might not be our strength, and it has always been easier to work in, for instance, refugee camps where it's more structured. But this is really, it shows us that we need to just learn how to work in urban settings. And I think that all this, just examples coming out, and by doing, we are showing different states and other actors about what is actually happening, about the urgency. And I would say that from a more individual level, and specialist researchers, like I mentioned before, I think focus your research and your time on trying to get a better understanding what's happening in specific locations, to populations, and what some of the links may be to climate change, and then to critically review the arguments, for instance, around how populations should be adapting to their new environments, which, that, like I say, that can be positive, but I think it's very important to look critically at that, and also to realize that, is this being proposed because states don't want to acknowledge the fact that people are actually forced to leave, and that they would actually need to receive other types of protection and assistance frameworks and mechanisms? Or is it actually because they believe that it's only development that would take people to more resilience and would improve the situation? So I would say that while doing research in the specific locations, to really look critically at what are the impacts and what may have caused this situation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Lynn. If anybody has last minute questions, feel free to post them below. But otherwise, we wanted to thank you on behalf of all of CCGHL members and our universities for such a wonderful, such a great and thoughtful presentation. And everybody else, if you have any questions for us or for Lynn, feel free to reach out, and we'll be happy to put you in touch. And
yeah, thank you. It has been a pleasure, and I'm glad to continue the conversation with any of you. I put my contact details at the end, and thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you, everybody.